Miss Marple and the knitting club that's Smouldered, dear listeners, welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, and it's such a joy to know you're spending this time with us. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? And was your day a calm one or a busy one? Write a little note in the comments and be sure to subscribe for our daily stories. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1, Thursday night. Needles and Steam. The clock in the tower of St. Mary Mead Church struck 7 as Miss Marple made her way along the narrow path that led to the Women's Institute workroom. The November evening had settled in early, bringing with it that particular dampness that seemed to seep into one's very bones. She drew her woolen shawl more closely about her shoulders and quickened her pace, mindful of the irregular paving stones beneath her sensible shoes. The workroom, situated in a converted stable block behind the main village hall, glowed with welcoming light from its tall windows. As Miss Marple pushed open the heavy door, she was enveloped by warmth and the familiar atmosphere of the Thursday evening knots and needles gathering. The paraffin stove in the corner ticked away steadily, its gentle heat taking the edge off the November chill. Near the curtained window, several blocking boards stood propped against the wall, lace shawls pinned flat upon them in intricate patterns. The tea urn on the side table gave forth a thin plume of steam, and the air was filled with the pleasant domestic sounds of women at work, the soft click and whisper of knitting needles providing a rhythmic accompaniment to the murmur of conversation. Mrs. Amelia. Trent stood near the central table, a commanding figure in her neat navy suit and pearls. As chairwoman of the St. Mary Mead Women's Institute, she had a way of organizing everything and everyone with brisk efficiency. Her hair was set in perfect waves, not a strand out of place, and her sharp eyes missed nothing that occurred within her domain. Miss Marple observed her greeting each arrival with a measured smile, making mental notes, no doubt, of who had arrived promptly and who had not. At a smaller table near the cupboard sat Mrs. Nellie Hart, the club treasurer. She was a softer sort of woman than Mrs. Trent, with gentle brown eyes and a diffident manner. Before her lay the large ledger in which she kept the club's accounts, and she was carefully entering figures with a stub of pencil, her lips moving slightly as she calculated. Miss Marple had always rather liked Nellie Hart. There was something touchingly conscientious about the way she approached her duties, double-checking every sum and keeping the minute book locked away in the workroom cupboard with an almost reverent care. Nora Bletchley, the energetic young secretary, was buzzing about like a particularly industrious bee. She had papers tucked under one arm and was consulting with Mrs. Trent about the agenda for the next committee meeting. Nora was one of those women who seemed to draw vitality from being useful, and she had attached herself to Mrs. Trent with something approaching hero worship. Near the window, Mavis Green had settled herself with her knitting basket. She was a young mother, pretty in a fresh-faced way, with quick fingers that flew through the stitches at remarkable speed. Her cream-colored wool lay in a soft heap beside her, and she was working on what appeared to be a small cardigan. The sharp scent of tobacco drifted in from the doorway where Sylvia Ransom stood, half in and half out, attempting to have a surreptitious cigarette. She owned the glove shop on the high street and had a reputation for being rather too modern in her habits. Mrs. Trent's lips had compressed into a thin line at the sight of her, but she said nothing yet. Owen Little, the caretaker, was a gloomy presence near the urn, checking that it had sufficient water and adjusting the valve on the paraffin stove. He was a man of few words, given to shaking his head dolefully over the many inadequacies of the building and its occupants. Miss Marple selected a chair near the window, settling herself with her knitting bag. Lady Bantry, her dear friend Dolly, was expected shortly. She had telephoned earlier to say she would be a few minutes late. As Miss Marple drew out her knitting, a pale blue jumper she was making for her great-nephew, she became aware of a faint scent in the air. It was not unpleasant exactly, but it was unexpected. Kerosene, or perhaps paraffin. Yet the stove was well maintained, and Owen Little, for all his gloominess, was meticulous about such things. Her eyes traveled to the blocking boards by the window, to Mavis Green's basket of cream wool, to the cupboard where Nellie Hart kept the club's records. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary, yet that scent lingered. Mrs. Trent's voice cut through the pleasant hum of conversation. "Good evening, ladies. If I might have your attention for just a moment. As you know, subscriptions are due for the half year. Mrs. Hart has kindly prepared the figures, and we shall collect them during the tea interval this evening." Nellie Hart looked up from her ledger, a slight flush rising in her cheeks. She was not comfortable being the center of attention. "I have the totals here, Amelia," she said softly. "I thought I might just add them in after we have our tea. It won't take a moment." Mrs. Trent moved closer to Nellie's table, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Don't fuss, dear. We shall help you tidy everything away properly. You know how particular you are about keeping things in order." There was something in the tone, Miss Marple thought. That was not quite right. A certain emphasis on the word particular, almost as though it were a criticism rather than a compliment. Nellie nodded and closed her ledger carefully, producing a small key from her handbag and moving to the cupboard. She unlocked it with her characteristic care, placing the minute book and cash tin inside, then locking it again and returning the key to her bag. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she watched these small domestic transactions. Her training in human nature, honed over decades of careful observation in St. Mary Mead, had taught her that it was often in such moments of apparent insignificance that the truth of things lay hidden. The door opened with a gust of cold air, and Lady Bantry swept in, bringing with her a breath of expensive perfume and the energy that always seemed to surround her. "Jane, I'm terribly sorry to be late. You know how it is." Dolly, still removing her gloves, made her way to the empty chair beside Miss Marple. The two friends exchanged smiles, and Miss Marple made room for Dolly's considerably larger knitting bag. The evening settled into its familiar rhythm. Needles clicked, conversation flowed in gentle eddies, and the tea urn continued its quiet simmer. Mrs. Trent moved about the room with her characteristic efficiency, pausing here to admire someone's work, there to make a small suggestion. At 5 minutes to 8, she called for attention once more. "Ladies, shall we have our tea now? Mrs. Hart, dear, if you would prepare the subscriptions list." Nellie Hart rose from her seat, patting her handbag to ensure the key was secure. Miss Marple, adjusting her position slightly to catch the light better for her knitting, found herself close to the window, near to where Mavis Green's cream wool lay in its basket. That faint scent of kerosene was stronger here, much stronger. Miss Marple's fingers continued their steady work, but her mind had begun to move along quite different paths. In a village, one learned to notice the small things, the things that did not quite fit, the scents that had no proper place, the looks that were a fraction too long or too carefully avoided. She filed the observation away in that capacious memory of hers, where so many odd little facts resided, waiting to form patterns. Outside, the November wind rattled the window panes. Inside, the paraffin stove ticked peacefully on, and the women of St. Mary Mead continued their knitting, unaware that the evening was about to take a most unexpected and sinister turn. Chapter 2. Smoke at the Skirting. It was precisely 10 minutes past 8 when Mrs. Dlesh, working on a particularly complicated cable pattern, first noticed the thin gray tendril rising from the skirting board beneath the window. She blinked, thinking perhaps her eyes were playing tricks in the lamplight. But no, there it was again, a delicate thread of smoke curling upward like some malevolent ghost. "I say," she ventured uncertainly, "is something burning?" The chatter in the room faltered. Heads turned. More smoke was visible now, not a great deal, but enough to cause alarm. "It's that beastly stove," declared Mrs. Fenwick, a large woman with decided opinions. I've said before, it's a danger. Owen Little lurched forward with the air of a man whose worst predictions were coming to pass. He reached the paraffin stove and began banging at its controls with the flat of his hand, muttering darkly about poor maintenance and councils that wouldn't spend a penny on proper equipment. But the smoke was thickening, and it was not coming from the stove at all. It was emerging from along the far wall, low down, spreading with an odd, oily quality that seemed to hug the floor before rising. Miss Marple had ceased her knitting. Her pale blue eyes, so often mistaken for vague, were sharp and alert. She watched the smoke's progress with the focused attention of a naturalist observing some curious phenomenon. The smoke rolled across the floor in a lazy, almost purposeful manner. It had an unpleasant smell, heavy and greasy, quite unlike the clean scent of burning wood or even the acrid bite of scorched fabric. "Outside, all of you," Mrs. Trent commanded, her voice cutting through the rising panic with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "At once, ladies, no fussing." There was a general movement toward the door. Lady Bantry grasped Miss Marple's arm. "Come along, Jane, don't be a goose about it." But as the room began to clear, Nellie Hart suddenly stopped in her tracks. Her hand flew to her handbag, and her face, already pale with alarm, went a shade paler still. "The book," she gasped. "Oh dear, the minute book and the cash tin. They're locked in the cupboard." "Leave them, Nellie," called Mrs. Trent from the doorway. "Don't be foolish." But Nellie Hart, that most conscientious of treasurers, was not to be deterred. The records were her responsibility. The thought of them being damaged or destroyed was evidently more than she could bear. "Just a moment," she said breathlessly, fumbling in her handbag for the key. "I'll be very quick." She darted back into the room, now thick with the strange, low-lying smoke. Miss Marple, still near the door with Lady Bantry's hand firmly on her sleeve, saw Nellie reach the cupboard and bend down, inserting the key with shaking fingers. The smoke seemed to grow denser, swirling around Nellie's feet, rising to her knees, her waist. It had an odd quality, this smoke, thick as fog, but without the clean coldness of fog. There was heat in it, certainly, but not the fierce heat of flames. It was a smothering, suffocating heat. "Nellie, come away," shouted Mavis Green from outside. But Nellie was coughing now, harsh, racking coughs that doubled her over. She staggered, one hand still gripping the cupboard door, the other pressed to her chest. Owen Little pushed past the women clustering at the entrance. His gloomy face was set in grim lines as he plunged into the smoke-filled room. Miss Marple caught a glimpse of him reaching Nellie, catching her as she collapsed, dragging her toward the door. "Make way! Make way!" he grunted, and the women scattered as he emerged, half carrying, half dragging the unconscious form of Nellie Hart. They laid her on the grass outside, away from the building. Someone had the presence of mind to fetch Dr. Haydock, who lived just across the village green. He arrived within minutes, his black bag in hand, his weathered face grave as he knelt beside the fallen woman. Miss Marple stood a little apart, her shawl drawn close, watching as the doctor worked. Lady Bantry hovered nearby, her usual ebullience subdued. "Will she be all right?" whispered Mavis Green, her pretty face stricken. Dr. Haydock looked up briefly. "Smoke asphyxia. Her pulse is weak, very weak. She has a heart condition, I believe. This sort of shock, the smoke inhalation, it's extremely dangerous for someone in her state." He returned his attention to his patient, and the little group fell silent. Inspector Slack arrived shortly thereafter, drawn by the commotion. He was a man who approached life with a perpetual air of irritation, as though the world existed primarily to inconvenience him. "What's all this, then?" he demanded, surveying the scene with ill-concealed impatience. "Fire, is it?" Mrs. Trent stepped forward, assuming command as naturally as she breathed. "The workroom, Inspector, smoke. A great deal of smoke." That wretched old stove, no doubt. Poor Mrs. Hart went back for the records and was overcome. Slack grunted and made his way to the workroom door, which Owen Little had propped open to let the smoke dissipate. He peered inside, then entered cautiously, handkerchief pressed to his nose. Miss Marple, without quite knowing how she had arrived there, found herself at the doorway as well. The smoke was clearing now, drifting out into the November night. But the smell lingered, that odd, oily, unpleasant smell. The room was in disarray. Chairs overturned in the hasty evacuation, knitting scattered across the floor. But there were no flames, no charred ruins, just that pervasive smoke stain on everything. And along the skirting board beneath the window, a line of char, black and distinct. Carelessness, muttered Inspector Slack, emerging from the room and wiping his face. These old stoves, they want proper attention. Could have been a disaster. He cast a baleful eye over the assembled women, as though suspecting them collectively of criminal negligence. Dr. Haydock was supervising the removal of Nellie Hart to his surgery. She had regained a flutter of consciousness but was in no state to speak. Her breathing was labored, her color poor. "She'll need watching through the night," the doctor said quietly to Mrs. Trent. It was a very near thing. A very near thing indeed. The women dispersed slowly, reluctantly. Their evening's entertainment transformed into something far more serious. There would be much to talk about in St. Mary Mead tomorrow. The telephone lines would be busy, and the post office would do a brisk trade as people called in for stamps and stayed to discuss the incident. Miss Marple walked home with Lady Bantry, who kept up a steady stream of speculation about faulty stoves and poor Owen Little's incompetence. Though I must say, Dolly remarked as they reached her gate, it seemed odd, didn't it? The smoke coming from the wall like that, not from the stove at all. Very odd, agreed Miss Marple softly. Very odd indeed. She did not elaborate, and Lady Bantry, knowing her friend's ways, did not press her. But as Miss Marple continued on to her own cottage, her mind was very busy indeed. Smoke that rolled low and thick and greasy. Smoke that seemed to have neither source nor reason. Smoke that had overcome a careful, dutiful woman who had returned for her precious records. And beneath it all, that scent of kerosene where kerosene had no business being. Miss Marple let herself into her cottage and hung up her shawl with methodical care. She put the kettle on for her nightly cup of cocoa, but her mind was far from domestic routine. There were patterns forming, dim as yet, but perceptible to one who had spent a lifetime observing the small betrayals and larger deceits that humans practiced upon one another. Something had happened in that workroom, something deliberate, and Miss Marple intended to discover precisely what it was. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices. White Crystals. The morning brought that pale, watery sunshine peculiar to late November, and with it a renewed sense of urgency about the previous evening's events. Miss Marple had slept poorly, her mind turning over the puzzle pieces that refused to form a coherent picture. After breakfast, she made her way back to the Women's Institute workroom. The door stood ajar, and she could hear Inspector Slack's voice from within, holding forth in his usual manner. Simple case of negligence, if you ask me. These women and their bits of craft work, no proper attention to safety. Miss Marple cleared her throat delicately from the doorway. Good morning, Inspector. I wonder if I might be permitted to collect my knitting. I left it rather abruptly last evening. Slack turned, his expression suggesting that elderly ladies retrieving knitting were precisely the sort of nuisance he had expected. Be quick about it, then. Don't touch anything else. Official investigation, this is. Miss Marple murmured her thanks and entered the room. In the clear light of day, it looked forlorn and disheveled. The blocking board still stood against the wall, the lace shawls now limp and smoke-stained. Her knitting lay where she had dropped it near the window. She bent to retrieve it, but her attention was caught by something else entirely. Where the smoke had first emerged along the skirting board, there was a line of char, blackened and distinct, and within that char, clearly visible now that the smoke had cleared, lay the remains of what appeared to be a length of cotton tape. It had been consumed almost entirely, curled and twisted by heat, but one could still discern what it had been. More interesting still were tiny white granular flecks scattered in the ash, crystalline and bright against the blackened wood. Miss Marple glanced toward Inspector Slack, who was occupied with Owen Little near the paraffin stove, discussing its mechanics with the air of a man determined to prove his point. She knelt down, her joints protesting slightly, and examined the white flecks more closely. They had a peculiar quality, these little grains. They crunched slightly when she touched them, like sugar, but they did not dissolve readily on her fingertip. She brought her finger close to her nose. No scent. Then, with the caution of someone who had once kept bees and knew the value of careful testing, she touched her fingertip very lightly to her tongue. Salt, but not quite salt. There was a bitter edge to it, a chemical tang that spoke of something added, something altered. She rose carefully and moved to examine the blocking board nearest the window. The lace shawl pinned to it was darkened by smoke, and the wooden pins had turned black at their heads, as though touched by intense but localized heat. The lace itself had an odd smell, distinct from the general smokiness of the room. Miss Marple bent closer, inhaling carefully. Paraffin, not the clean smell of the paraffin used in lamps and stoves, but something older, more concentrated. Paraffin wax, perhaps. Her eyes traveled to the curtain that hung at the window. Its hem was scorched in a remarkably clean line, level with the top of the blocking board. The pattern of burning was curious. It had moved horizontally along that line, not upward as one would expect from a fire that had originated below. Inspector Slack's voice boomed across the room. "Found your knitting, have you, Miss Marple? Best be on your way now. We've work to do here." Miss Marple straightened, her knitting bag clutched to her chest. "Of course, Inspector. I do apologize for intruding, though I couldn't help but notice the most interesting thing." Slack's expression suggested that he could, in fact, help it very well indeed, and would prefer to do so. "Oh, yes? And what would that be?" Miss Marple gestured delicately toward the skirting board. "The fire seems to have traveled along the wall to the blocking board, rather than from the board outward. One would expect, if the stove were at fault, or if something near the stove had caught, that the pattern would be quite different." Slack strode over and stared down at the charred marks with ill-concealed annoyance. Smoke goes where it will. No accounting for it, but Miss Marple was not to be deterred. "And those white granules in the ash, they're quite distinctive, are they not?" "Not ash at all, really, but something crystalline." Slack bent down, frowning. He prodded at the white flecks with a thick finger. "Some sort of mineral from the floorboards. I expect old buildings. They're full of odd deposits." Miss Marple said nothing more, but as she left the workroom, she carried with her a clear picture of what she'd seen. The cotton tape consumed by a slow, creeping burn. The white crystals that crunched and tasted of chemicals. The paraffin smell concentrated on the lace, and the clean horizontal line of scorching on the curtain hem. She found Lady Bantry at the post office, as she had rather expected to. Dolly was holding forth to a captive audience of 3 village ladies about the dramatic events of the previous evening. "Jane," Dolly exclaimed, catching sight of her friend, "I was just telling everyone about poor Nellie. Have you heard? Dr. Haydock says she's stable but still very weak. Her heart, you know. It was touch and go." "I'm very glad to hear she's improving," said Miss Marple. "Dolly, might I have a word in private?" The 2 women stepped outside into the thin November sunshine. Lady Bantry looked at her friend with barely suppressed curiosity. You've got that look, Jane. Your detecting look. What have you found? Miss Marple drew her shawl closer against the chill. Something rather troubling, I'm afraid. That fire last night, it wasn't what it appeared to be, an accident. Surely the stove... Miss Marple shook her head slowly. No, I don't think it was the stove at all. I think someone laid a trail, Dolly. A deliberate trail designed to smolder slowly and produce a great deal of smoke. The kind of smoke that would overcome someone and perhaps destroy certain items without creating an obvious blaze. Lady Bantry's eyes widened. But that would mean it was deliberate, that someone wanted to harm Nellie or destroy something in that room. Or both, said Miss Marple quietly. The minute book was in the cupboard along with the cash tin. Nellie was lured back to fetch them at precisely the moment when the smoke would be at its worst. Dolly was silent for a moment, absorbing this. What sort of trail? What could burn like that? Cotton tape, I believe, soaked in some chemical compound that allows it to burn slowly. I've seen something similar used for lighting garden bonfires, though that was many years ago. And the white crystals in the ash, they tasted of saltpeter. Saltpeter? Dolly looked puzzled. But that's used for preserving meat, isn't it? And for making explosives, among other things, agreed Miss Marple. It can be purchased quite innocently from any chemist for legitimate purposes. But when soaked into fabric and dried, it creates what is known as a slow match, the sort of thing that burns steadily without flame, producing exactly the kind of creeping char I saw this morning. But who would know such a thing? And why? Miss Marple's face was troubled. That, my dear Dolly, is what we must discover. But I think we may safely assume that whoever arranged this knew a great deal about Nellie Hart's habits. They knew she would return for the minute book. They knew she had a weak heart, and they wanted either her dead or the contents of that cupboard destroyed, or possibly both. The two women stood in silence for a moment, the gravity of the situation settling over them like a cold mist. What will you do? Asked Lady Bantry at last. Miss Marple's jaw set in that firm line that her friends recognized as determination. I shall begin by finding out who purchased saltpeter recently, and paraffin, and any other items that might be used to create such a device. Mr. Pratt at the chemist shop keeps excellent records. He's always been most meticulous about such things. And if you find something, then I shall take it to Inspector Slack, though I suspect he will not welcome my interference. But this was not an accident, Dolly. Someone in our village, someone we know, tried to commit murder last evening, and we must ensure they do not succeed on a second attempt. With that, Miss Marple set off toward the high street, her step purposeful despite her years. Behind her, Lady Bantry watched with a mixture of admiration and concern, then hurried to catch up with her friend. Whatever came next, she was determined to be part of it. Chapter 4. The Cotton Tape That Crackled. The Women's Institute had reconvened somewhat nervously in the main hall rather than the workroom. The atmosphere was subdued, the usual cheerful chatter replaced by hushed conversations and anxious glances. News of Nellie Hart's condition had spread through the village, with the speed that bad news always seemed to achieve in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple arrived, to find the meeting already in progress. Mrs. Trent was addressing the assembled women with her customary efficiency, though there was perhaps a certain tightness about her mouth that had not been there before. We must carry on as Nellie would wish us to, she was saying. The accounts are in order, and I have taken the liberty of securing them in my own keeping until she's well enough to resume her duties. Be quick about it, then. Don't touch anything else. Official investigation, this is. Miss Marple murmured her thanks and entered the room. In the clear light of day, it looked forlorn and disheveled. The blocking board still stood against the wall, the lace shawls now limp and smoke-stained. Her knitting lay where she had dropped it near the window, She bent to retrieve it, but her attention was caught by something else entirely. Where the smoke had first emerged along the skirting board, there was a line of char, blackened and distinct, and within that char, clearly visible now that the smoke had cleared, lay the remains of what appeared to be a length of cotton tape. It had been consumed almost entirely, curled and twisted by heat, but one could still discern what it had been. More interesting still were tiny white granular flecks scattered in the ash, crystalline and bright against the blackened wood. Miss Marple glanced toward Inspector Slack, who was occupied with Owen Little near the paraffin stove, discussing its mechanics with the air of a man determined to prove his point. She knelt down, her joints protesting slightly, and examined the white flecks more closely. They had a peculiar quality, these little grains. They crunched slightly when she touched them, like sugar, but they did not dissolve readily on her fingertip. She brought her finger close to her nose. No scent. Then, with the caution of someone who had once kept bees and knew the value of careful testing, she touched her fingertip very lightly to her tongue. Salt, but not quite salt. There was a bitter edge to it, a chemical tang that spoke of something added, something altered. She rose carefully and moved to examine the blocking board nearest the window. The lace shawl pinned to it was darkened by smoke, and the wooden pins had turned black at their heads, as though touched by intense but localized heat. The lace itself had an odd smell, distinct from the general smokiness of the room. Miss Marple bent closer, inhaling carefully. Paraffin, not the clean smell of the paraffin used in lamps and stoves, but something older, more concentrated. Paraffin wax, perhaps. Her eyes traveled to the curtain that hung at the window. Its hem was scorched in a remarkably clean line, level with the top of the blocking board. The pattern of burning was curious. It had moved horizontally along that line, not upward as one would expect from a fire that had originated below. Inspector Slack's voice boomed across the room. "Found your knitting, have you, Miss Marple? Best be on your way now. We've work to do here." Miss Marple straightened, her knitting bag clutched to her chest. "Of course, Inspector. I do apologize for intruding, though I couldn't help but notice the most interesting thing." Slack's expression suggested that he could, in fact, help it very well indeed and would prefer to do so. "Oh, yes? And what would that be?" Miss Marple gestured delicately toward the skirting board. "The fire seems to have traveled along the wall to the blocking board, rather than from the board outward. One would expect, if the stove were at fault, or if something near the stove had caught, that the pattern would be quite different." Slack strode over and stared down at the charred marks with ill-concealed annoyance. Smoke goes where it will. No accounting for it, but Miss Marple was not to be deterred. "And those white granules in the ash, they're quite distinctive, are they not?" "Not ash at all, really, but something crystalline." Slack bent down, frowning. He prodded at the white flecks with a thick finger. "Some sort of mineral from the floorboards. I expect old buildings. They're full of odd deposits." Miss Marple said nothing more, but as she left the workroom she carried with her a clear picture of what she'd seen. The cotton tape consumed by a slow, creeping burn, the white crystals that crunched and tasted of chemicals, the paraffin smell concentrated on the lace, and the clean horizontal line of scorching on the curtain hem. She found Lady Bantry at the post office, as she had rather expected to. Dolly was holding forth to a captive audience of 3 village ladies about the dramatic events of the previous evening. "Jane!" Dolly exclaimed, catching sight of her friend. "I was just telling everyone about poor Nellie. Have you heard? Dr. Haydock says she's stable but still very weak. Her heart, it was touch and go." "I'm very glad to hear she's improving," said Miss Marple. "Dolly, might I have a word in private?" The 2 women stepped outside into the thin November sunshine. Lady Bantry looked at her friend with barely suppressed curiosity. "You've got that look, Jane. Your detecting look. What have you found?" Miss Marple drew her shawl closer against the chill. Something rather troubling, I'm afraid. That fire last night, it wasn't what it appeared to be. An accident. Surely the stove. Miss Marple shook her head slowly. No, I don't think it was the stove at all. I think someone laid a trail, Dolly. A deliberate trail designed to smolder slowly and produce a great deal of smoke. The kind of smoke that would overcome someone and perhaps destroy certain items without creating an obvious blaze. Lady Bantry's eyes widened. But that would mean it was deliberate, that someone wanted to harm Nellie or destroy something in that room. Or both, said Miss Marple quietly. The minute book was in the cupboard along with the cash tin. Nellie was lured back to fetch them at precisely the moment when the smoke would be at its worst. Dolly was silent for a moment, absorbing this. What sort of trail? What could burn like that? Cotton tape, I believe, soaked in some chemical compound that allows it to burn slowly. I've seen something similar used for lighting garden bonfires, though that was many years ago. And the white crystals in the ash, they tasted of saltpeter. Saltpeter? Dolly looked puzzled. But that's used for preserving meat, isn't it? And for making explosives, among other things, agreed Miss Marple. It can be purchased quite innocently from any chemist for legitimate purposes. But when soaked into fabric and dried, it creates what is known as a slow match, the sort of thing that burns steadily without flame, producing exactly the kind of creeping char I saw this morning. But who would know such a thing, and why? Miss Marple's face was troubled. That, my dear Dolly, is what we must discover. But I think we may safely assume that whoever arranged this knew a great deal about Nellie Hart's habits. They knew she would return for the minute book. They knew she had a weak heart, and they wanted either her dead or the contents of that cupboard destroyed, or possibly both. The two women stood in silence for a moment, the gravity of the situation settling over them like a cold mist. What will you do? Asked Lady Bantry at last. Miss Marple's jaw set in that firm line that her friends recognized as determination. I shall begin by finding out who purchased saltpeter recently, and paraffin, and any other items that might be used to create such a device. Mr. Pratt at the chemist shop keeps excellent records. He's always been most meticulous about such things. And if you find something, then I shall take it to Inspector Slack, though I suspect he will not welcome my interference. But this was not an accident, Dolly. Someone in our village, someone we know, tried to commit murder last evening, and we must ensure they do not succeed on a second attempt. With that, Miss Marple set off toward the high street, her step purposeful despite her years. Behind her, Lady Bantry watched with a mixture of admiration and concern, then hurried to catch up with her friend. Whatever came next, she was determined to be part of it. Chapter 4. The Cotton Tape That Crackled. The Women's Institute had reconvened somewhat nervously in the main hall rather than the workroom. The atmosphere was subdued, the usual cheerful chatter replaced by hushed conversations and anxious glances. News of Nellie Hart's condition had spread through the village, with the speed that bad news always seemed to achieve in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple arrived, to find the meeting already in progress. Mrs. Trent was addressing the assembled women with her customary efficiency, though there was perhaps a certain tightness about her mouth that had not been there before. Must carry on as Nellie would wish us to, she was saying. The accounts are in order, and I have taken the liberty of securing them in my own keeping until she's well enough to resume her duties. Nora Bletchley sat in the front row, looking rather more subdued than was her wont. She twisted a handkerchief between her fingers and kept glancing at the door as though hoping for news. Miss Marple took a seat beside her and laid a gentle hand on the younger woman's arm. You mustn't blame yourself, dear. These things happen. Nora turned to her with reddened eyes. But I feel so dreadful about it all, Miss Marple. That tape I was using to measure the shawls, the one that burned, I think it must have been lying near the stove or something. If only I'd been more careful. Miss Marple's interest sharpened immediately, though her expression remained one of mild sympathetic concern. The tape that burned? You had been using it that evening? Nora nodded miserably. Yes, just earlier. Mrs. Trent asked me to check that the blocked shawls were all the regulation length for the competition. I used a length of cotton tape because I couldn't find the proper measuring tape. It was in the sewing basket by the window. And you left it there? I must have done. I was called away to help with the tea, and I suppose I simply forgot about it. The tape made the oddest sound when I handled it, though. It crackled, almost like paper does when it's very dry. I remember laughing about it with Mavis. Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly behind her placid exterior. Cotton tape did not ordinarily crackle like paper, not unless something had been done to it. Do you recall where the tape came from originally? Nora frowned, thinking, the sewing basket, I suppose. We keep all sorts of bits and pieces in there, though. Now you mention it, I don't remember seeing that particular tape before. It was quite stiff, not like ordinary tape at all. At that moment, Mavis Green approached, her pretty face anxious. Nora, I've been thinking about what you said about the tape crackling. It really was the strangest thing, wasn't it? Almost as though it had been starched or something. Miss Marple rose from her seat with an air of decision. Ladies, would you mind terribly if I asked to see the sewing basket? I believe I may have left a needle in there last week, and I should like to retrieve it. It was a transparent excuse, but neither Nora nor Mavis seemed inclined to question it. They led Miss Marple to the side table where the basket sat, still containing its jumble of threads, buttons, and fabric scraps. Miss Marple sorted through the contents with careful fingers. At the bottom of the basket, she found what she was seeking, a small piece of cotton tape, perhaps 3 inches long, overlooked in the general confusion. She lifted it to the light, examining it closely. The tape was stiff, unnaturally so, and when she flexed it gently between her fingers, it made a faint crackling sound. She brought it close to her nose, sniffing delicately. There was a faint scent, something chemical and vaguely familiar. She touched the very tip of the tape to her tongue so lightly that neither of the watching women noticed the gesture. The same bitter, salty taste she had detected in the white crystals on the workroom floor. "May I keep this?" she asked. "I should like to show it to someone." "Of course," said Nora, "though I can't think what use it would be." Miss Marple tucked the piece of tape carefully into her handbag and returned to her seat. Mrs. Trent called the meeting back to order, but her mind was far from the business of the Women's Institute after the meeting concluded. She sought out Lady Bantry. "I need to visit Owen Little," she said without preamble. "Will you come with me?" Dolly, who had been hoping for something interesting to occur, agreed at once. They found the caretaker in his small shed behind the village hall, surrounded by tools and tins of paint. He looked up from the hinge he was mending with his habitual gloom. "Miss Marple, Lady Bantry, come about the fire, have you?" "In a manner of speaking," said Miss Marple. "Mr. Little, you're a man of considerable experience with maintaining buildings and equipment. I wonder if you might be able to identify something for me." She produced the piece of tape from her handbag and handed it to him. Owen turned it over in his calloused fingers, frowning. "Cotton tape," he said. "But it's been treated with something." "Makes it stiff like this." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "Any idea what might cause such an effect?" Owen scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well now, there's a few things. Starch, like Mrs. Green said, but this feels different. More like—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Like when we used to make slow match for the bonfires when I was a lad." "Slow match?" Lady Bantry looked puzzled. Owen's weathered face brightened slightly at the memory. "Aye. You take a bit of rope or cotton, soak it in a solution of saltpeter and water, then let it dry. Burns real slow, it does, without flame." perfect for setting off a bonfire from a safe distance or lighting fireworks. We'd use it every November the 5th. Miss Marple and Lady Bantry exchanged significant glances. And this tape, Mr. Little? Does it feel like it might have been treated in such a fashion? Owen held it up to the light, flexed it, and nodded slowly. Could well be. Has that same stiff quality and that crackle when you bend it. Haven't seen the like in years, though. Nobody bothers with such things nowadays. How would one go about making such a match? Asked Miss Marple casually. Simple enough. Mix saltpeter with water until it dissolves. Soak your cotton or rope in it. Then hang it up to dry. Once it's dry and stiff, you've got yourself a slow match. Touch a flame to one end and it'll burn steady as you please. No flame to speak of, just a creeping char. And where might one obtain saltpeter these days? Owen shrugged. Any chemist would stock it. Used for all sorts, meat preserving mostly. Some folks use it in the garden too, though you'd want to be careful with it. Not dangerous in itself, but you wouldn't want to be mixing it with certain other things. Miss Marple thanked him warmly and took back the piece of tape. As she and Lady Bantry walked away from the shed, Dolly spoke in a low voice. So someone made a slow match and laid it along that skirting board. But how did they light it without being seen? That is indeed the question, agreed Miss Marple, along with several others. Who had access to the sewing basket? Who would know how to make such a device? And most importantly, who stood to gain from either Nellie Hart's death or the destruction of the Whodunit book? They had reached the gate of Miss Marple's cottage. She paused, her hand on the latch. I think, Dolly, that it's time we paid a visit to Mr. Pratt's shop. If someone purchased saltpeter recently, he will have a record of it. He's always been most meticulous about keeping track of such sales. Lady Bantry's eyes gleamed with the light of the chase. When shall we go? Tomorrow morning, said Miss Marple firmly. First thing. And in the meantime, I think I shall pay a visit to Dr. Haydock. I should like to know precisely how Nellie Hart is progressing, and whether she's been able to say anything about what happened. Do you think she saw something? Miss Marple's expression was grave. I think, my dear, that she may well have seen a great deal, which is precisely why we must ensure that she remains safe until we can discover who is responsible for this dreadful business. The two women parted, and Miss Marple made her way into her cottage. She placed the piece of treated tape on her kitchen table and regarded it with a mixture of fascination and distaste. Someone in St. Mary Mead had planned this attack with considerable care and knowledge, someone who understood chemistry and fire, someone who had access to the workroom and the sewing basket, and someone who had known with chilling precision exactly when and how to strike. Chapter 5. Paraffin in a Ball of Cream. Miss Marple's visit to Dr. Haydock's surgery that afternoon yielded little in the way of direct information. Nellie Hart remained in a fragile state, drifting in and out of consciousness, and the doctor was firm that she should not be disturbed. The smoke did considerable damage to her lungs, he explained, ushering Miss Marple into his consulting room. Combined with her heart condition, it's a wonder she survived at all. Another few minutes in that room and we'd be planning a funeral rather than a recovery. Has she said anything about what happened? Dr. Haydock shook his head. Nothing coherent. She's muttered a few words, something about a note in the cupboard, but nothing I could make sense of. When she's stronger, perhaps, but not yet. Miss Marple thanked him and made her way homeward, her thoughts troubled. A note. That was interesting. What sort of note would have compelled Nellie Hart to risk her life returning to that smoke-filled room? The following morning dawned gray and cold. Miss Marple was up early, and by 9 she and Lady Bantry were making their way to Mr. Pratt's establishment on the High Street. The shop was a curious hybrid of chemist and ironmonger, a relic of an earlier age when such combinations were commonplace in village life. The bell jangled as they entered, and Mr. Pratt emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on his apron. Miss Marple, Lady Bantry, good morning to you both. What can I do for you? Miss Marple approached the counter with her usual air of gentle inquiry. Mr. Pratt, I wonder if I might trouble you with what may seem an odd question. Have you sold any saltpeter recently, within the past week or so? Mr. Pratt's eyebrows rose slightly, but he was too well trained in discretion to show excessive surprise. Saltpeter? Well now, let me consult the ledger. We don't sell much of it these days, so it should be easy enough to check. He produced a large leather-bound book and began turning pages, his finger tracking down columns of entries. Ah yes, here we are. One purchase of saltpeter, 4 days ago Thursday afternoon, that would be 2 ounces. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained placid. Might I ask who the purchaser was? Mr. Pratt hesitated for the briefest moment. I'm not sure I should say, Miss Marple. Customer confidentiality and all that. Lady Bantry leaned forward, her most imperious manner in full force. Mr. Pratt, there was a fire at the Women's Institute workroom. Mrs. Hart very nearly died. If the purchase of saltpeter is connected to that incident, we need to know. Mr. Pratt's face grew serious. I had heard about poor Mrs. Hart. Very distressing. Well, in that case, I suppose I have a duty to assist. The purchaser was Mrs. Amelia Trent. The name hung in the air between them. Lady Bantry drew in a sharp breath, but Miss Marple merely nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. And what reason did Mrs. Trent give for the purchase? She said it was for pickling beef, Mr. Pratt replied, which is a perfectly ordinary use for saltpeter, I might add. Nothing suspicious about it at all. Of course not, agreed Miss Marple. Did she purchase anything else at the same time? Mr. Pratt consulted his ledger again. Let me see. Yes, she also bought a small quantity of paraffin, some brown paper cones, and a blue bag. Oh, and beeswax. Quite a list, actually. Paraffin for the stove, perhaps? Suggested Lady Bantry. Mr. Pratt nodded. That's what she said, though we just filled the stove the day before, so I did think it odd she'd need more so soon. And the blue bag and beeswax? The blue bag, she said, was for laundry, and the beeswax for treating yarn. Again, all perfectly innocent purposes. Miss Marple thanked him warmly, and they left the shop. Once outside, Lady Bantry grasped her friend's arm. Jane, this is serious. Amelia Trent bought all the materials one would need to create that slow match and start the fire. But why on earth would she want to harm Nellie Hart? That is what we must discover, said Miss Marple. But first I should like to examine Mavis Green's knitting. She mentioned that her cream wool ball rolled near the stove, and Mrs. Trent kindly wound her a fresh ball from the hank. But what is that to do with anything? Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. That smell of paraffin I noticed the first evening, Dolly. It was strongest near Mavis's wool. And if Mrs. Trent wound that ball, she had the opportunity to introduce something into it. They found Mavis at home, her small cottage near the church, cheerful with chintz curtains and the smell of baking. She welcomed them with surprised pleasure and ushered them into her sitting room. I've been so worried about Mrs. Hart, she said, bringing in tea and biscuits, and I can't help feeling that somehow I should have noticed something wrong that evening. My dear, you mustn't blame yourself, said Miss Marple. But I wonder, might I see the cream wool you were knitting with that night? Mavis looked puzzled, but fetched her knitting basket readily enough. She drew out the ball of cream-colored wool and handed it to Miss Marple. I haven't worked on it since that evening. It seems somehow unlucky now. Miss Marple held the ball close to her face and inhaled carefully. The smell of paraffin was unmistakable, strong and chemical. She squeezed the ball gently, feeling its texture. This wool was freshly wound for you that evening? Yes, by Mrs. Trent. She saw that my ball had gotten dirty somehow, rolling across the floor, and she very kindly offered to wind me a fresh one from the hank. I thought it was so good of her. And did you notice anything unusual about it afterwards? Mavis frowned, thinking. Well, it did feel rather greasy, now you mention it. I thought perhaps it was the natural lanolin in the wool, but it seemed stronger than usual. And the smell, that odd chemical smell. I assumed it had been near the paraffin stove. Miss Marple set the ball down carefully on the table. Mrs. Green, I need to ask you something rather important. When Mrs. Trent wound this wool for you, did you watch her do it? Not really. I was talking to Nora about the competition entries. Mrs. Trent was sitting by the window, and I saw her winding, but I wasn't paying close attention. And the original ball, the one that had gotten dirty, what became of it? Mavis looked uncertain. I'm not sure. Mrs. Trent took it away, I think. She said something about not wanting it to spoil the clean wool. After they left Mavis's cottage, Lady Bantry turned to her friend with dawning comprehension. She treated the wool with paraffin wax. That's why it smelled so strongly. But why? Miss Marple's face was grim. Because paraffin-soaked wool burns very well, Dolly, but slowly and with a great deal of smoke. If you were to place such wool near a slow-burning fuse, it would catch and smolder, producing exactly the sort of thick, oily smoke we witnessed that evening. Lady Bantry shuddered. It's diabolical. She planned the whole thing, didn't she? The slow match along the skirting, leading to the wool, and the wool placed near enough to the blocking board and curtain to spread the fire. Not to spread flames, corrected Miss Marple. To spread smoke, thick, choking smoke that would overcome anyone who remained in the room and obscure what was really burning, but surely someone would have noticed Mrs. Trent treating the wool with paraffin. Not if she did it while winding, very carefully. A little wax rubbed into the strands as she wound them around the ball. It would take only a moment. And who pays attention to someone winding wool? It's such an ordinary domestic action. They walked in silence for a few moments, the full horror of the plot becoming clear. We must go to Inspector Slack, said Lady Bantry firmly. Not yet, replied Miss Marple. We have evidence of means and opportunity, but we still lack motive. Why would Amelia Trent, chairwoman of the Women's Institute, respected member of the community, attempt to murder Nellie Hart and destroy the minute book? Until we understand that, Inspector Slack will dismiss our findings as speculation. Then what do we do? Miss Marple's jaw set in determination. We examine that minute book very carefully indeed, and we discover what Nellie Hart knew. That was worth killing for. Chapter 6. Alibi by the Stovegate. The question of how to examine. The minute book without arousing suspicion proved less difficult than Miss Marple had anticipated. Mrs. Trent, in her capacity as acting treasurer, had taken to working on the accounts at home, and it required only a simple telephone call to arrange a visit under the pretext of clarifying the Christmas bazaar budget. Lady Bantry accompanied Miss Marple to Mrs. Trent's house, a neat brick villa on the edge of the village with an immaculate front. Garden and starched lace curtains. Mrs. Trent received them with her usual brisk courtesy, though there was a watchfulness in her eyes that had not been there before. Do come in. I have the books laid out in the morning room. Such a dreadful business with poor Nellie. One can only hope she recovers fully. The morning room was as orderly as one might expect, everything in its appointed place. The minute book lay on the desk along with a cash tin and a sheaf of receipts, all arranged with geometric precision. Miss Marple settled herself in the offered chair and began to leaf through the minute book with every appearance of casual interest. Lady Bantry engaged Mrs. Trent in conversation about the bazaar, a tactical maneuver they had agreed upon beforehand. The entries were in Nellie Hart's careful hand, methodical and precise. Miss Marple's eye tracked down the columns of figures, noting the subscriptions collected, the expenditures authorized, the balance carried forward from month to month. Then she found it, a page near the back, recording the previous month's transactions. The bottom corner of the page showed signs of damage, a torn edge where something had been removed. The tear was clean, not the ragged edge that smoke or flame would have produced. This had been done deliberately before the fire. Miss Marple ran her finger lightly over the remaining portion of the page. There was a faint greasiness to the paper, and when she brought her hand close to her nose, that telltale scent of paraffin was there, very faint, but unmistakable. More interesting still was what remained visible on the page. Nellie had noted a payment of $12 for new curtains, marked with her characteristic question mark in the margin. Below it, in figures so small they were almost illegible, she had penciled a corrected total that reduced the cash in hand by exactly that amount. Mrs. Trent's voice cut across her thoughts. "Is everything clear, Miss Marple?" "The accounts are somewhat disrupted, I'm afraid, given the circumstances." Miss Marple looked up with a bland smile. "Perfectly clear, thank you. Though I noticed there was a payment for curtains. Have they been installed yet?" Mrs. Trent's expression flickered just for an instant. "Not yet. The invoice has been delayed. You know how tradespeople are these days." Miss Marple made a small notation on her paper and rose to leave. As they walked back through the village, Lady Bantry burst out the moment they were out of earshot. "She's lying about those curtains, isn't she?" "There are no curtains," Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I believe the money was taken for another purpose entirely." $12 is a considerable sum, and Nellie Hart had noticed the discrepancy. That question mark beside the entry was quite telling. But surely one doesn't commit murder over $12. "Perhaps not for oneself," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "but for someone else, someone whose ruin would reflect badly upon Mrs. Trent herself. It might be a different matter." They spent the remainder of the afternoon piecing together the movements of everyone present on that fateful Thursday evening. Miss Marple had a particular gift for extracting information without appearing to interrogate, and by tea time they had assembled a remarkably complete picture. Owen Little had filled the tea urn at 7:45 and attended to the stove. He had then gone round to the coal yard at approximately 8 o'clock and had not returned until the alarm was raised. Several people had seen him loading coal into his barrow, grumbling about the cold and the inadequate budget for heating. Mrs. Trent had been moving about the room throughout the evening, collecting subscriptions and, as Mavis confirmed when questioned again, helping to wind the fresh ball of cream wool. This had occurred between 7 and 8 o'clock, with Mrs. Trent sitting by the window, the perfect position to set her preparations in motion. Nellie Hart had locked the minute book and cash tin in the cupboard at precisely 8 o'clock. Several women remembered this because the church clock had chimed the hour just as she turned the key. She had then returned to her seat and appeared settled for the evening. Sylvia Ransom had stepped outside for a cigarette at 8:02. Miss Marple had noticed this herself as Sylvia had passed near her chair on the way to the door. She had remained outside for approximately 5 minutes, and her account was corroborated by the butcher's boy, who'd been making a late delivery and had exchanged pleasantries with her. Nora Bletchley had been in the small adjoining office, typing up a notice about the Christmas bazaar. She'd been there from 8 o'clock until the commotion began, and the clacking of her typewriter had been audible through the thin wall. The crucial period, Miss Marple realized, was between 8 and 8:10, when the smoke had first been noticed. During those 10 minutes, someone had managed to send Nellie Hart back into danger. She found Nora that evening at her small flat above the greengrocer's. The young woman was pale and anxious, still clearly distressed by the events. "Miss Marple, I'm so glad you've come. I've been thinking about that evening, and there's something I should have mentioned before. Miss Marple settled herself in the offered chair and waited with patient attention. Nora twisted her handkerchief nervously. "It's about the note, the one they found near Mrs. Hart. I believe it might have been in Mrs. Trent's handwriting." "What makes you say that?" Nora rose and fetched a sheet of paper from her desk. "Because she asked me to type this notice earlier in the evening, just before 8. She stood over me while I did it, which was rather unusual. And then I remember her saying something odd. If dear Nellie seems flustered about the accounts, be kind and suggest you fetch the book to check the figures." "And did you do so?" Nora's face crumpled. "No, I didn't need to. But don't you see? She was preparing an excuse, a reason why Nellie might go back to the cupboard. And if she wrote a note to Nellie suggesting there was an error in the subscriptions, Nellie would have felt obligated to check immediately." Miss Marple examined the typed notice carefully. At the bottom there was a faint blue smudge, the kind that sometimes transferred from carbon paper. "May I keep this?" "Of course, Miss Marple. Do you think Mrs. Trent is responsible?" "It seems so impossible. She's always been so efficient, so proper." Miss Marple folded the paper carefully. "My dear, in my experience, it is often the most proper people who are capable of the most improper acts. They have reputations to maintain, you see, and sometimes the effort of maintaining them drives them to desperate measures." As she walked home through the darkening November evening, Miss Marple considered the pieces of the puzzle, now almost complete. Mrs. Trent had purchased the materials. She had prepared the slow match and the paraffin-treated wool. She had positioned herself near the window where the fire would start, and she had ensured, through a carefully worded note, that Nellie Hart would return to the cupboard at precisely the moment when the smoke would be at its most dangerous. But there was still the question of proof. Inspector Slack would not act on suspicion and circumstantial evidence alone. They needed something conclusive, something that would demonstrate beyond doubt that Amelia Trent had planned and executed this terrible crime. The answer, Miss Marple was certain, lay in that minute book. Tomorrow she would need to examine it again, more carefully this time, and perhaps pay a visit to Agnes Reed at the post office, who had an uncanny ability to remember who had purchased what and when. The pieces were falling into place. Soon, very soon, the picture would be complete. Chapter 7. The Butcher's Saltpeter and Pratt's Paper Cones. Agnes Reed had worked at the St. Mary Mead post office for 30 years, and in that time she had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of village transactions. If a stamp was purchased, a parcel posted, or a money order sent, Agnes knew of it. More pertinently for Miss Marple's purposes, she also knew what everyone bought at the small general goods counter that occupied one corner of the establishment. Miss Marple found her arranging a display of writing paper when she entered shortly after opening time. "Good morning." "Agnes, I wonder if you might help me with a small matter." Agnes brightened immediately. She had always been fond of Miss Marple, and the prospect of being helpful was clearly appealing. "Of course, Miss Marple. What is it you need?" Miss Marple approached the counter and spoke in a confidential tone. "I'm trying to trace a purchase that may have been made here last week. Brown paper cones, the sort used for wrapping sweets or holding small quantities of dry goods." Agnes nodded promptly. "Oh yes, we stock those. Not many people buy them these days, but we keep a few boxes in the back. Let me think now." She tapped her chin thoughtfully. "Mrs. Trent bought some just last Thursday afternoon, a packet of them, along with some other bits and pieces. Do you recall what else she purchased?" Agnes's eyes narrowed in concentration. "Well, she didn't buy the saltpeter here. That would be Mr. Pratt's domain. But she did pick up some washing blue, the kind in the little bags, and she asked particularly for the brown paper cones. Said she needed them for storing seeds or some such." Miss Marple thanked Agnes warmly and made her way back to Mr. Pratt's establishment. She found him in the back room measuring out a prescription with meticulous care. Miss Marple, back again so soon? More questions about Thursday's purchases, if you don't mind, Mr. Pratt. I wonder if you could tell me more about the saltpeter Mrs. Trent bought. What form does it take? Mr. Pratt set down his measuring glass and led her to a shelf where various chemical compounds were stored in labeled jars. It comes as small white grains, rather like coarse salt. See here? He opened a jar and showed her the contents. The crystals were indeed very like those Miss Marple had seen in the ash at the workroom. And when mixed with water, it dissolves readily enough. Then when the solution dries, the saltpeter recrystallizes. It's the principle behind preserving meat, you see. The saltpeter penetrates the fibers and forms crystals within, which prevents spoilage. And if one were to soak fabric in such a solution? Mr. Pratt's eyebrows rose, but he answered readily enough. The same principle would apply. The fabric would absorb the solution, and when it dried, you'd have saltpeter crystals distributed throughout the fibers. Makes the fabric burn quite differently, more slowly and steadily. Dangerous business, actually. We had a case years ago where some stage curtains treated with fireproofing chemicals caught fire during a production. The chemicals had degraded into something rather combustible. Very nasty affair. Miss Marple thanked him and departed, her mind working rapidly. The picture was becoming clearer with each piece of information. She found Lady Bantry at home, and together they paid a call on Owen Little once more. The caretaker was in the village hall attempting to repair a broken window latch. "Mr. Little," said Miss Marple, "I recall you mentioning that you used to make slow matches for bonfires when you were young. Could you walk me through the process once more?" Owen set down his tools, happy to share his reminiscences. "Simple enough, as I said. You'd take your saltpeter, about 2 ounces would do for a good length of rope, and dissolve it in warm water, half a pint or so. Then you'd soak your cotton rope or tape in the solution, making sure it was thoroughly saturated. And then hang it up to dry, someplace warm and airy. Takes a day or 2 to dry completely. Once it's dry and stiff, you've got your slow match. Light one end and it'll creep along burning without flame, just a slow char. Used to fascinate us as boys watching it burn. Would the resulting ash contain white crystals?" Owen nodded vigorously. "Oh yes, wherever it burned, you'd find white residue. That's the saltpeter that didn't burn off. You see, it doesn't all get consumed in the burning process. And one could make such a match from cotton tape as easily as from rope? Easier, perhaps. Thinner material would soak more evenly and dry faster. Yes, cotton tape would work very well indeed." Miss Marple and Lady Bantry exchanged glances. Another piece confirmed. Their next stop was the village hall workroom itself. Inspector Slack had declared it safe to enter, though the smell of smoke still lingered. Miss Marple made her way to the cupboard where Nellie Hart had kept the minute book. She examined the lock carefully, taking a small magnifying glass from her handbag. There, caught in the mechanism of the keyway, were tiny white grains, barely visible but unmistakable. "Look, Dolly, salt crystals in the lock. They were brushed there by someone's fingers, someone who had been handling saltpeter. But surely anyone might get dust in a lock. Not this particular kind of dust, and not in this particular lock, which Nellie Hart cleaned religiously every month. She was most particular about the care of the cupboard." Miss Marple straightened, her examination complete. She walked slowly around the room, retracing the events of that evening in her mind. Mrs. Trent had sat by the window, winding Mavis's wool with paraffin worked into the strands. The treated cotton tape had been laid along the skirting earlier, perhaps during the general bustle of arrival, where no one was paying particular attention. The lace on the blocking board had been positioned close to the curtain, close enough that the smoldering wool would reach it, and then, at the crucial moment, a note had been slipped to Nellie Hart. A note in Mrs. Trent's distinctive hand, suggesting an error in the accounts, and requesting that Nellie fetch the minute book to verify the figures. It was so carefully planned, so meticulously executed, the sort of crime that could only be committed by someone with intimate knowledge of the workroom, of the habits of those who used it, and of the weakness that could be exploited. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage with her knitting and a cup of cocoa, turning the problem over in her mind. The how was clear. The who was clear. But the why still eluded her, or rather, the complete picture of the why Armor 12 was missing from the accounts. Mrs. Trent had taken it, almost certainly, but for what purpose? And why was it so important that the evidence be destroyed? The telephone rang, startling her from her reverie. It was Dr. Haydock. "Miss Marple, I thought you'd want to know. Mrs. Hart has regained full consciousness. She's still weak, but her mind is clear, and she's been asking to see you." Miss Marple set down her knitting with a sense of purpose. "I shall come at once." At the surgery, Nellie Hart lay propped against pillows, her face pale but her eyes alert. She grasped Miss Marple's hand with surprising strength. "Miss Marple, I need to tell someone what I discovered. The accounts, you see, there were irregularities. Take your time, dear. Tell me everything." Nellie's voice was weak but steady. "I was checking the half-year figures, and I noticed several small amounts that didn't quite add up. Nothing major, just a pound here, 10 shillings there, but they accumulated to $12 over the course of 6 months. And when I cross-referenced the expenditures against the receipts, I found that certain purchases had never actually been made. The curtains were the most recent, but there were others. Seeds for the garden that were never planted, books for the lending library that never arrived." "And you confronted Mrs. Trent about this?" Nellie shook her head. "Not directly, but I made notes in the margin of the minute book. I was planning to ask her about it privately after the meeting. I didn't want to embarrass her publicly if there was a simple explanation." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "You were very kind, too kind perhaps. Rest now and don't worry about anything. You've told me what I needed to know." As she walked home through the cold November night, Miss Marple felt the final piece click into place. Now she understood, and tomorrow she would ensure that justice was done. Chapter 8. A Note That Sent Nellie to the Cupboard. The revelation of the systematic embezzlement opened new avenues of inquiry, but Miss Marple knew that understanding the motive required discovering where the money had gone. 12 taken gradually over 6 months suggested not reckless spending, but a steady need, a debt perhaps, or an obligation that Mrs. Trent felt compelled to meet. She began her inquiries discreetly, as was her way. A conversation with the postmistress revealed that Mrs. Trent had been sending regular postal orders to London over the past several months. A chat with the station master disclosed that she had made 2 trips to town in recent weeks, both on days when she might have been expected to attend to Women's Institute business. It was Lady Bantry. However, who provided the crucial piece of information? She arrived at Miss Marple's cottage mid-morning, slightly breathless and clearly excited. "Jane, I've discovered something rather interesting. Do you remember Mrs. Trent's nephew, Gerald? The one who was always getting into scrapes?" Miss Marple set aside her knitting and gave her friend her full attention. "I recall hearing mention of him. He works in London, does he not? Something to do with sales. Catalogue sales, to be precise. And according to my cousin Mildred, who knows his landlady, he got himself into rather serious trouble a few months ago. Some scheme involving advance orders and deposits that never materialized into actual goods. The company was prepared to prosecute, but someone paid the outstanding debts." 12, Mildred said. Miss Marple drew in a sharp breath. "And Mrs. Trent is his only living relative. She raised him after his parents died." "Exactly." Mildred said the landlady mentioned how devoted Mrs. Trent was to the boy despite his shortcomings. She'd visit him regularly and was always making excuses for his behavior. The pieces were assembling themselves into a coherent whole. Mrs. Trent, respectable and proper, had discovered her nephew's disgrace and had acted to protect him. But she lacked the funds herself, and so she'd borrowed from the Women's Institute accounts, no doubt intending to repay the money gradually without anyone noticing. But Nellie Hart had noticed. Miss Marple rose with decision. "We need to find that note, Dolly, the one that sent Nellie back into the workroom. It may be the most damning evidence of all." They returned to Dr. Haydock's surgery, where Nellie Hart was now sitting up and taking light nourishment. She greeted them with a warm smile. "Miss Marple, Lady Bantry, how kind of you to visit again." Miss Marple settled herself in the chair beside the bed. "Mrs. Hart, I need to ask you about the note. Dr. Haydock mentioned you spoke of one. Can you tell me about it?" Nellie's brow furrowed in concentration. "Yes, there was a note. It was slipped under my knitting patterns while I was having tea. I didn't see who put it there, but when I picked up my things, there it was. Do you remember what it said?" Nellie closed her eyes, recalling. Something about the subscription figures being wrong. It said to bring the book. Just those few words. It was signed with the letter A. And you assumed it was from Mrs. Trent. Well, naturally, she's the chairwoman and the handwriting looked like hers. Very firm and clear. I thought perhaps she'd noticed an error when she was collecting the subscriptions earlier. And what became of the note? I had it in my hand when I went to the cupboard. I must have dropped it when the smoke overcame me. Miss Marple and Lady Bantry exchanged glances. If the note could be found, it would provide direct evidence of Mrs. Trent's involvement. They made their way to the workroom once more. Inspector Slack was there conducting what he termed a final inspection before releasing the room back to general use. "Ah, Miss Marple. Come to collect more knitting, have you?" Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Actually, Inspector, I wondered if you had found a small note among Mrs. Hart's belongings. She had it with her when she collapsed." Slack grunted and consulted a list. Personal effects removed from the scene. 1 handkerchief, 1 keyring, various knitting implements. No note mentioned. Might it still be in the workroom? Slack shrugged. "Feel free to look. Place is being cleaned out tomorrow regardless." Miss Marple and Lady Bantry began a systematic search. The area near the cupboard where Nellie had fallen yielded nothing. The smoke had scattered papers and disturbed the general arrangement of the room, making the search more difficult. It was Lady Bantry who found it, tucked beneath the leg of an overturned chair. "Jane, look." The note was small, written on a piece of notepaper torn from a standard pad. The handwriting was indeed firm and clear, unmistakably Mrs. Trent's distinctive script. The message was brief. "Sub's wrong. Bring book, A," but there was something else. At the bottom edge of the note, barely visible, was a smudge of blue, the same laundry blue that Agnes Reed had mentioned Mrs. Trent purchasing. Miss Marple held the note up to the light, examining it carefully. "This is very interesting, Dolly. Very interesting indeed." They took the note to Nora Bletchley, who examined it with growing dismay. "This is the same paper I use for typing notices. We keep a pad of it in the small office. And look, that blue smudge. It's exactly like the carbon paper I was using that evening when I typed the bazaar notice." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Mrs. Trent was with you when you typed that notice, was she not?" "Yes, standing right behind me, watching to make sure I got the wording correct. She's always very particular about such things. And the carbon paper?" Nora picked up a sheet from her desk. "It's the same. See, when you handle it, sometimes you get blue smudges on your fingers. If she touched this notepaper after handling the carbon paper, it would transfer." Miss Marple folded the note carefully and placed it in her handbag. "Thank you, my dear. You've been most helpful." As they walked away, Lady Bantry spoke in a low voice. "It's conclusive, isn't it?" She wrote the note deliberately, using only the initial to maintain deniability. But the paper, the blue smudge, the handwriting, they all point to her. Miss Marple nodded gravely. She stood over Nora while the typing was done, handling the carbon paper. Then she tore a sheet from the notepad and wrote the message. She knew Nellie would respond immediately, that her sense of duty would compel her to verify the accounts, and she timed it, precisely so that Nellie would reach the cupboard just as the smoke became overwhelming. It's monstrous. It is the act of a desperate woman, said Miss Marple, quietly, a woman who saw her reputation and her nephew's future in jeopardy, and who chose to protect them at any cost. They returned to Miss Marple's cottage, where she laid out all the evidence on her dining table, the piece of treated cotton tape, the ball of paraffin-soaked wool, the record of purchases from Mr. Pratt and Agnes Reed, the testimony about the missing money, and now the note in Mrs. Trent's handwriting. "Tomorrow," she said firmly, "we take this to Inspector Slack, all of it. He may not welcome the interference, but even he cannot ignore such comprehensive evidence." Lady Bantry looked at the array of items with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. To think that Amelia Trent, of all people, could do such a thing? She always seemed so correct, so upright. Miss Marple's expression was somber. "That is often the way, Dolly. The people most concerned with appearances are sometimes the ones most capable of terrible acts to preserve them. Mrs. Trent built her entire life around being respectable, being admired, being in control. When that image was threatened, she could not bear it. And so she acted, not out of cruelty, I think, but out of a kind of desperate pride." She paused, gazing out at the November afternoon. "The tragedy is that Nellie Hart would almost certainly have been discreet about the missing money. She might have arranged for quiet repayment, protected Mrs. Trent's reputation while ensuring the Institute's funds were restored. But Mrs. Trent did not trust in kindness. She trusted only in elimination. And that thought, Miss Marple felt, was the saddest thing of all." Chapter 9. The Minute Book with a Torn Leaf. Inspector Slack received Miss Marple and Lady Bantry the following morning with his customary lack of enthusiasm. He sat behind his desk at the police station looking rather like a bull terrier confronted with an unwelcome visitor. "Miss Marple, Lady Bantry, I'm a busy man. What can I do for you?" Miss Marple arranged herself primly in the offered chair and set her handbag on her lap. "Inspector, I believe I have information regarding the incident at the Women's Institute workroom, information that suggests it was not an accident." Slack's expression shifted from irritation to skepticism. "Not an accident?" "The stove malfunctioned. Simple as that." Miss Marple opened her handbag and began extracting items with methodical precision. The piece of cotton tape, the note, photographs she had asked the village photographer to take of the char marks, and the blocking board placement. "If I might walk you through what actually occurred that evening, Inspector." Over the next quarter hour, Miss Marple laid out the case with quiet authority. She explained the properties of saltpeter-treated fabric, demonstrated with Owen Little's testimony how a slow match could be created, and showed the purchase records from Mr. Pratt's shop. She presented the paraffin-soaked wool and explained how it would smolder without flame. She showed the note with its telltale blue smudge and explained its significance. "Inspector." Slack's expression had transformed, from skepticism to grudging interest, and finally to something approaching respect. "And the motive?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "That requires examining the minute book more closely, specifically the page with a torn corner. Mrs. Trent has been embezzling small amounts from the Institute funds to cover debts incurred by her nephew. Nellie Hart discovered the discrepancies and had noted them in the margin. The fire was meant to destroy that evidence, and I'm afraid to silence Mrs. Hart permanently." Slack was silent for a long moment, turning over the pieces of evidence on his desk. "This is serious, Miss Marple. Very serious. I'll need to examine that minute book myself. Mrs. Trent still has it in her possession as acting treasurer. Then I shall pay her a visit this afternoon. He looked at Miss Marple with something that might have been grudging admiration. You've done thorough work here. More thorough than I'd have expected from a civilian. Miss Marple smiled gently. One observes, Inspector. That is all. One observes and one remembers. That afternoon, accompanied by a constable, Inspector Slack called upon Mrs. Trent. Miss Marple and Lady Bantry, though not officially part of the delegation, happened to be passing by and were invited, with some reluctance from Slack, to be present. Mrs. Trent received them in her morning room, her posture erect and her expression composed. Only a slight tightening around her eyes betrayed any concern. Inspector Slack, this is unexpected. How may I help you? Slack cleared his throat. I need to examine the Women's Institute minute book, Mrs. Trent, as part of our investigation into the fire. Mrs. Trent's face remained impassive. Of course, I have it here. She retrieved the book from her desk and handed it over. Slack opened it to the page Miss Marple had indicated, the one with the torn corner. The page was smoke-darkened but legible. The entries were in Nellie Hart's careful hand, documenting subscriptions received and expenditures. Authorized. And there, in the margin, beside the entry for curtains, was Nellie's. Small question mark in her pencil. Correction of the total, but it was what lay beneath the torn section that drew Slack's attention. Pressed flat against the page, barely. Visible but unmistakable under close inspection were traces of paraffin and a single tiny salt crystal, exactly as Miss Marple had described. This page was torn before the fire, said Slack, not as a question, but as a statement. Mrs. Trent said nothing. And these marks here, this grease and this crystal, they match the materials used to start the fire deliberately. Still, Mrs. Trent remained silent, though her hands had begun to tremble slightly. Inspector Slack set down the book and fixed her with a steady gaze. Mrs. Trent, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you take money from the Women's Institute accounts without authorization? For a long moment, the room was absolutely still. Then very quietly, Mrs. Trent spoke. It was not theft. I intended to return every penny. Slack's voice was not unkind. But you did take the money. Mrs. Trent's composure finally cracked. She sank into her chair, her face pale. My nephew was in terrible trouble. The company was going to prosecute him for fraud. It would have ruined him, destroyed any chance of a decent future. I had no choice. I borrowed the funds temporarily, just until I could arrange matters. I was already making small repayments by inventing false expenditures and pocketing the difference. And when Mrs. Hart discovered the discrepancies, she was going to expose me, not publicly perhaps, but she would have insisted on a full accounting. My reputation would have been destroyed. The scandal would have reflected on Gerald. I couldn't allow that, so you attempted to destroy the evidence and to kill Mrs. Hart. Mrs. Trent looked up, her eyes bright with tears. Not kill, never that. I only meant to create enough smoke to obscure the pages, to make them unreadable. She was supposed to stay outside with the others. The note was just to ensure she wouldn't have the book with her, that it would be safely in the cupboard where the smoke would reach it, but not burn it. Entirely. But you knew about her weak heart. Mrs. Trent's face crumpled. I thought she would be sensible. I thought she would wait for Owen or one of the others to fetch it. I never imagined she would go back herself into such danger. Miss Marple spoke for the first time, her voice gentle but firm. But you knew her character, Mrs. Trent. You knew she was dutiful and conscientious. You knew she would go back for those records because they were her responsibility. You created a situation that you knew would compel her to put herself in mortal danger. Mrs. Trent turned to her, and for a moment something like recognition passed between them. You understand, don't you, Miss Marple? You understand what it is to maintain standards, to uphold respectability. I have worked my entire life to be beyond reproach. To have that destroyed over a moment of weakness, over helping someone I love, it was unbearable. Miss Marple's gaze was steady and sad. I understand the temptation, Mrs. Trent, but understanding is not the same as condoning. You placed your pride above another woman's life. That is something that can neither be excused nor forgiven. Inspector Slack rose, signaling to his constable. Amelia Trent, I'm arresting you on suspicion of attempted murder and arson. You need not say anything further. As Mrs. Trent was led away, her back remained straight, her head held high. Even in disgrace, she maintained the appearance of dignity that had governed her entire life. Lady Bantry let out a long breath. How dreadful. How absolutely dreadful. Miss Marple gathered her things quietly. Pride is a terrible master. Dolly, it demands sacrifices that become ever greater, until finally it demands the sacrifice of one's very soul. Mrs. Trent thought she was protecting her reputation and her nephew's future, but in truth she was only protecting her image of herself, and for that image, she was willing to commit murder. They walked out into the November afternoon, where the first hints of winter were beginning to show in the bare branches and the cold wind. The case was solved. Justice would be served, and Nellie Hart would recover. But Miss Marple felt no triumph, only a deep sadness for the waste of it all. A life nearly lost, a reputation destroyed, and all for the sake of appearances and a misguided sense of duty to family. It was, she reflected, a very human tragedy, and those were always the saddest kind. Chapter 10. Why Room? Fuse Wax and the Chairwoman Who Helped. 3 days after Mrs. Trent's arrest, the Women's Institute workroom had been aired, cleaned, and declared safe for use. The members, however, had shown little enthusiasm for returning to the scene of such near tragedy, and so the room stood empty until Miss Marple suggested it might be time for a gathering to, as she put it, lay the ghost to rest. On a gray December afternoon, she assembled the principal players in the drama. Inspector Slack attended, looking uncomfortable in civilian company, but grimly determined to see the matter through. Dr. Haydock was present, having brought Nellie Hart, now sufficiently recovered to walk with assistance. Lady Bantry sat beside Miss Marple, her usual vivacity subdued by the solemnity of the occasion. Nora Bletchley was there, pale and anxious, still wrestling with her conscience over her unwitting role. Mavis Green sat with her knitting in her lap, though her fingers were still. Sylvia Ransom stood near the door, her cigarette case unopened for once. Owen Little occupied a chair near the window, his gloomy countenance even more pronounced than usual. Miss Marple rose from her seat, and the quiet conversation ceased. She stood there for a moment, a small elderly lady in sensible shoes and a good wool dress, and yet somehow commanding the room's complete attention. I thought it might be helpful, she began, her voice clear and steady, to walk through exactly what happened that Thursday evening, not for sensation, but for understanding, so that we may all put this dreadful business behind us with full knowledge of the truth. She moved to the window, where the blocking boards had been returned to their usual position, well away from the curtains. Mrs. Trent's plan was elaborate but not complicated. She had 3 objectives: to create a fire that would appear accidental, to destroy evidence in the minute book without burning it beyond recovery, for that would be too suspicious, and to ensure that Mrs. Hart could not testify to the financial irregularity she had discovered. Nellie Hart made a small sound, and Dr. Haydock's hand moved protectively to her shoulder. Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but inexorable. The method was clever in its simplicity. Mrs. Trent purchased saltpeter from Mr. Pratt's shop, ostensibly for pickling beef. She also bought paraffin, brown paper cones, beeswax, and laundry glue. Each item had an innocent purpose that would arouse no suspicion. Inspector Slack nodded, following her reasoning. At home, Mrs. Trent prepared her materials. She dissolved the saltpeter in water and soaked a length of cotton tape in the solution. When it dried, the tape became stiff and crackled when handled. This treated tape would burn slowly without flame, creating exactly the sort of creeping char we found along the skirting board. But how did she get it into position? Asked Nora, her voice trembling slightly. Someone would have noticed. Miss Marple smiled sadly. Would they? Think back to that evening. People arriving, removing coats, arranging their knitting, chatting. Mrs. Trent, as chairwoman, moved about freely, organizing, helping, being efficient. Who would notice if she bent down near the skirting to adjust a blocking board or retrieve a dropped item? A moment's work to lay the tape along the floor, tucked close to the wall where it would not be seen. Owen Little grunted. And the wool? The ball that smelled of paraffin? Miss Marple turned to Mavis Green. That required Mrs. Trent to be even more bold. She had treated wool with paraffin wax, working it into the fibers as she wound. When young Mrs. Green's ball became soiled, Mrs. Trent kindly offered to wind a fresh one. But the wool she wound was her own prepared wool that would smolder readily when exposed to heat. Mavis pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, understanding dawning in her eyes. My wool? She used my wool as part of the fire? I'm afraid so. Mrs. Trent positioned this wool near where the slow match ended, and she placed the blocking board closer to the curtain than was usual or safe. Owen, you would never have placed it so close. Owen shook his head emphatically. Never. Fire hazard plain as day. Miss Marple moved to stand near the cupboard. The final element was timing. Mrs. Trent needed to ensure that when the smoke became dangerous, Mrs. Hart would be in precisely the wrong place, so she wrote a note, brief and seemingly innocent, suggesting an error in the subscription figures and requesting that Mrs. Hart fetch the minute book. She paused, letting this sink in. The note was written on paper taken from the office where Nora was typing. When Mrs. Trent handled the carbon paper while supervising the typing, she transferred blue dye to her fingers. A smudge of this dye appears on the note, small, easily overlooked, but definitive. Nellie Hart spoke for the first time, her voice still weak but clear. She knew I would check immediately. She knew I was particular about the accounts. Yes, said Miss Marple gently. She knew your character. Mrs. Hart, she counted on your sense of duty and responsibility. At approximately 8 o'clock, as the slow match approached the paraffin-treated wool, she arranged for you to receive the note. You would go to the cupboard, unlock it, and be overcome by the thick smoke produced when the wool began to smolder. But the slow match, interrupted Sylvia Ransom. How did she light it without being seen? Miss Marple's expression was almost admiring in its assessment of the criminal ingenuity involved. That was perhaps the cleverest part. A slow match does not require an open flame held to it for any length of time. A single touch of a lit match is sufficient to start the char. During the general movement and conversation, perhaps when bending near the window to adjust something, a match struck and touched to the end of the tape hidden by the skirting. It would have taken mere seconds. The tape would then burn invisibly for several minutes before reaching the wool. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. The white crystals you found, Miss Marple? Those were the key, weren't they? They were certainly illuminating. Saltpeter leaves distinctive crystalline residue when it burns. Once I identified those crystals, the method became clear. The rest was a matter of determining who had purchased the necessary materials and who had the opportunity to arrange matters. And the motive, said Lady Bantry, the missing money for her nephew. Miss Marple nodded. 12 taken gradually to save her nephew from prosecution for fraud. Mrs. Trent convinced herself she was acting nobly, protecting family, But when Mrs. Hart discovered the discrepancies and noted them in the minute book, Mrs. Trent's carefully constructed respectability was threatened. She could not bear the thought of exposure, of scandal, of being known as someone who had betrayed the trust placed in her. She paused, her blue eyes sad. So she chose to eliminate both the evidence and the witness, not out of cruelty, I believe, but out of desperate pride. She told herself that Mrs. Hart would not go back into danger, that the smoke would simply obscure the incriminating pages. But in her heart, she must have known what would happen. She knew Mrs. Hart's weak heart. She knew her sense of duty. She created a trap and baited it with the one thing Mrs. Hart could not resist, her responsibility to the Institute. The room was silent. Outside, a few flakes of snow had begun to fall, the first of winter. Dr. Haydock spoke gruffly. Well, she failed. Mrs. Hart survived, and the evidence was clear enough without the minute book. Thanks to Miss Marple, said Inspector Slack with what was, for him, remarkable graciousness. Without her observations and persistence, we'd have ruled it an accident caused by the stove. Miss Marple resumed her seat, suddenly looking very tired. I observed, Inspector, nothing more. The tragedy is that none of it was necessary. Mrs. Hart, had she been approached honestly, would likely have arranged a discreet repayment plan. But Mrs. Trent could not bring herself to confess weakness, to admit fault. Her pride would not permit it, and so she turned to violence, destroying herself far more thoroughly than any financial scandal ever could have done. Nellie Hart spoke softly. I would have helped her if only she had asked. I know, dear, said Miss Marple, but some people cannot ask for help. They can only demand respect and control. When they lose control, they panic. And panic combined with intelligence and determination can be very dangerous indeed. As the gathering dispersed, Lady Bantry walked home with Miss Marple through the gently falling snow. I suppose the Institute will need a new chairwoman. Miss Marple smiled faintly. They will indeed. I rather think Nellie Hart might be persuaded to take the position once she's fully recovered. She has the temperament for it, kind but firm. And Mrs. Trent will face trial for attempted murder. Her barrister will argue diminished responsibility, desperation on behalf of family. But the premeditation was too clear, the method too calculated. She will go to prison, I expect. They reached Miss Marple's gate. The cottage looked warm and welcoming in the winter twilight. You know, Dolly, the saddest thing about this entire business is how unnecessary it all was. A small theft easily remedied, but pride and fear transformed it into something monstrous. Mrs. Trent used what lay at hand: saltpeter from the butcher, paraffin from the chemist, a bit of cotton tape, common items, domestic items. But it was the intent that made them deadly, the intent that burned. Lady Bantry shivered, and not entirely from the cold. Come in for cocoa, offered Miss Marple. Thank you, Jane. I think I should like that very much. And the two friends went inside, leaving the snow to quietly cover the troubled village of St. Mary Mead.